Hello everyone, today the random lottery provides us with yet another late medieval government topic that is also surprisingly similar to the one that we discussed the other day, but focusing in fact on a very different and complementary aspect of the same political and institutional mechanism. I always say this is the proof of it, that the cycle follows a specific divine guidance that wants us to look at different things while at a time passing to others. And this has specifically to do with, from one side, we've seen it the other day, the role of the nobility, or say the barons, the oligarchs, you can call them different ways, that tended to fundamentally mitigate, right, check and control the expansion of monarchic power, to the point that in some cases this was basically collapsed by the same dynamic. And that the latter tended to actually be supported by whom? By the commoners, right? Which is also a pretty concrete highlight on how today's people completely tend to misrepresent power, political, social dynamics in the history of civilization by mostly thinking that there is a terrible state that always takes over without nobody knows which kind of power from whom, right? As if, some random people that would be evil but for some reason had power and the others didn't. And that instead, in fact, the regime would not be the product of at least the same result of the decisive moral forces intended as the one of the entire community, which also means that, of course, if you individually you're very weak. As a matter of fact, your moral capacity will not even count that much in the government, which is also how, thankfully, in every age, today's included, states are run by an elite that is the actually most competent one, aside from the one that you see, let's say, selected out. Those are the terrible elite. There is an actual establishment of the better human beings in the society that basically make things run. And then at the top there can be an idiot more often than not. That is, however, the reflection in many ways of what the rest of the country is about. And that, however, work behind the scene to make things work. This would actually sound like the nobility is behind that, and in part it is true. We were even talking about this other days ago regarding the Concordia Ordinum, right? There is a traditional view, of course, of the role of the patriciate, and it's difficult in history to find a singular physiognomy of this dynamic because, of course, there are different forms of government. But what, again, ultimately matters is how cohesive these communities are. And how, in fact, in spite of these formal differences, they can achieve results together. For example, this is one of the cases of the West. I will not digress on modern examples, but let's say, politically wise, however, the notion that there wouldn't be a cohesive Western identity, for example, because, for example, certain governmental forms are different is nonsensical, and especially there's sort of self-referential obsession, and very much exploited also by non-Westerners that would like to tell you, look, you're all different. We're not different. That is actually the founding principle of European identity, that we are incredibly similar. We're basically also the same people at large in many ways, but we are because we are morally cohesive in those fundamentals, and our diversity does not do anything but reinforce the fact that we are that unitary in direction. And any attempt to pretend that this is not there, unfortunately, for those who make it, is going to fail. However, since we literally dominated the world and the most important things that were happening in the globe were basically due to us, it's obvious that our singularities, our differences and divides were overly exalted because, say, I don't know, it's very important to know why a German is different from a French or a British from an Italian, etc. But this does not mean that these differences are the overarching narrative. And it is, especially in a certain part of the West, just a very self-referential exercise to presume that these differences are almost like the ones that exist between Westerners and non-Westerners, which is, in turn, the product of general ignorance about what properly outside of the West, the world is like, which is basically just pure barbarity, obscurity, and subnormal sewage that, of course, the inferior, the lesser of our society feel bound to, because, of course, lesser people feel attracted to inferior cultures in the hope that, they can live in a world where there are no standards, in which people do not see where, that who fails and how and why. And everybody can actually see it. Just have a bit more of merit, you will understand it yourself. But this is why it's also important to, so little, Schwerpunkt digression, just to be all, nicer and with humanistic pity and mercy and whatever. This is why even the more minimal differences within the West must be fundamentally understood to understand, in turn, the world itself. And late medieval Europe provides with a lot of that for a number of reasons, not even the better ones, while there is this notion of progress towards the end of the millennium. We're actually witnessing the crisis of universal powers and the emergence of, in fact, more self-concerned and more, in the sense, relativistic national powers that before stuck to the universal one, so together with that national force that now instead is placed at the service of something less than the more, right? And thus will lead to further secularization and modernization, so distance from tradition and dimming the light, let's say the awareness of God in the heart of their people. In any case, also other very encouraging step at the beginning of this video, there is also some good into it, or better, the broader dynamic is not positive, but of course there is an attempt to make for that broader collapse. So it's not just due to it's due to everyone in this sense, but that can be compensated, as I explained before, if you understand that there can be a revival, not just a survival of power, when you have a unity of intent, and so even alliances, bonding, and so on. This is a different theme, right? But since we will proceed with some comparative analysis of different kingdoms, like in the video of the other day, it's important to realize how different first of all, of course, every country's history is regarding these trends, but how there are some still within the spectrum, some specific currents and especially outcomes, right? Including, and this is very important, especially in the early modern age, and that's why the late medieval times is the moment in which the seeds of these fruits are properly sown. Either like a reinforcement of the state, and in general, again, of this political power, and this is most typical, in fact, of the westernmost part of Europe, or like in Central Europe, mostly collapse of the same state, and so some greater difficulty in enhancing power in the following centuries, regardless of the fact that this would, in some cases at least, actually develop some, think about the Sonderweg, and so if you look at the Habsburgic Empire at some point in the 18th century, you can't claim it was a failure, right, in that regard as well. So this tells you also about the fluidity, the malleability, and the fact that there is not really a deterministic or structuralistic formula for, like if you simply have that specific institution, as I was just saying at the beginning, as Europeans, we will either just do better or worse, right? It's mostly about moral forces, and at times you can have that in very different types of socio-political systems. In the last video, we rightly emphasized, and I'm glad that I also opened to a further debate, in my opinion, the Magna Carta was somehow appreciated on England, right? And in fact, the very topic balance of power that was essentially emphasized, especially after the Magna Carta. And that moment in early 13th century English history is actually very traumatic, not much just for the crown, but for the country as well. Basically, the English lose almost all continental territories. There is a re-Britannicization to the degree, also a re-Anglicization of the same English monarchy in the process. And as we explained, yes, we must be particularly thankful that Anglo-Saxon culture had the Magna Carta because of what the Anglo-Saxons were able to do in later history, and from which we all benefited in great part. And so whichever, the general take on the Magna Carta in that historical moment, it's definitely something we must appreciate in that broader perspective. But indeed, at the time, this was actually a disaster for the English monarchy that literally lost at Louvain the opportunity of basically hegemonizing the entire northwestern Europe, and actually chapeau to King John, not just for having almost wiped out the Capetian state building, but also managed, after that clamorous defeat, to maintain his monarchy, also thanks to the intervention of a pretty Catholic, in this sense, universal power, Innocent III, were the peak of the great of papal power historically. That, although having supported the Capetians, as you know, and the Hohenstaufen that were allied with them, and having countered, in fact, the same English and Otto of Brunswick, the German allies, actually defended and protected John of England. And the stability of the same English monarchy. Actually, the work of the papacy behind this, and even in terms of nation and state building in the Middle Ages in general, is probably one of the single most underrated topics ever. We'll have to prepotently come back on that, because I don't watch much YouTube history around, but I definitely do not see any actual focus on papal relations with other countries. Well, admittedly, on Schwerpunkt, we haven't done so much ourselves about that, but very often narratives about the states are, there's the state, in fact, in a nationalistic sense, right? Or, this very modernized understanding of how these countries pose themselves in the international arena, as if they were just solid, homogeneous states that did whatever they wanted, or even when they were dealing with internal issues, such as the baronial ones, for that matter, speaking of the Magna Carta, this was still an anomaly, and it hadn't been just like the normal mechanic that basically interfered with, was intertwined with all these different levels, the various estates, the various states, the various universal powers, etc. But going to the subject matter, in England, as early as the latter half of the 13th century, the monarch acknowledged the political role of the commons, right? So the House of the Lords, the House of Commons, in order to do what, as we prefigured before, to protect the crown's interest against the barons. In other words, the lords had become overly powerful. They were actually, in that same second half of the 13th century, reinforcing with the Clarendon constitutions, the provisions of Oxford, we will see now, their own, that were in a sense more important than the Magna Carta itself. Like, the Magna Carta was the groundbreaker, right? And from a strictly legal institutional point of view, like, it was these other provisions that really reinforce that baronial privilege that, as we've seen also for other countries the other days, is not really unique to the English monarchy. Just like, common law was actually present everywhere at the time, regardless of the fact that Roman law was being recuperated and, however, put to, side to side with common law and quite gradually expanding. We've seen that other constitutions emerged, also, in 1222 Hungary. They were the cornerstone for actually the extension of such wide baronial privileges that, as you know, those monarchies on the longer run would actually collapse. England was more solid. It was a stronger Western feudal glue to it that, paradoxically, even though starting as a decentralized system, was actually more cohesive at the end of the day, and thanks to Western moral forces bringing to more results, also in statal development than, in fact, those other countries in the East. But, of course, the necessity was something we've seen also for the Roman Empire. Again, the emperors, for example, being actually closer to the plebs than to the Senate in terms of political direction, right? Surely, it's not like emperors weren't patricians and they were individually detached and probably personally despising the plebs. But politically wise, if you wanted to remain a monarchy, you had to make leverage on this communal aspect. We have observed that also for example, the development exactly in these generations of the famous English tactics of the 100 Years' War, where, as we've seen, the longbowmen and especially their quantity, their ratio would come to be so important in a sense to partly counter the same nobility without, however, as light infantry to challenge like the entire system. It was a problem for France, for England, for any other feudal power for that matter. But this was also true in many different dynamics, also in the Italian communes that were fundamentally some sort of republics. You can spot the equivalent of a feudal elite that checked the people and also witnessed some attempts to monarchization and so on. Again, don't be fooled just by the formalistic institutional approach, right? Also because historiography is a bit too replete of this kind of, at least stopping to that juridical formalism, not really seeing how alive or dying in some cases these institutions could actually be. There isn't just the archive source to understand history, right? The same provisions of Oxford that reiterated some baronial privileges actually were also displaying that this monarchic protection of the commoners to receive in turn from them like some guarantees on proper loyalty to the crown. The provisions of Oxford had established a baronial council with representatives from the knights and burgesses to oversee royal governance and limit magnate dominance, in fact. So it's not like that, like the barons could simply say, the monarchy goes down, the barons can simply rise, right? Especially in the West, where there are strong, other strong orders and estates. In other words, it's a more socially stratified and sort of economically vibrant system, but there is probably another vision of politics altogether. The other estates will say, wait a minute, even as knights, as bourgeois, etc., we have something to say regarding what the nobleman, the higher nobility can be. Especially because by the 13th century, as we've seen in other videos, the divide between the high nobility and, say, the average, for example, aristocrat was increasingly marked. This is something we've seen also for France, for example, that paradoxically had to, in fact, develop a massive third estate administration, unlike England, that more or less remained, however, with higher or lower aristocrats in charge of the local counties in a quite sort of personal, direct way, because there was less state objectively, but also, as we've seen recently in the video about the Tudor army organization, less factual, absolute power around. But these attempts are really important. I made multiple videos about Henry III, Edward I. That's the era. And it gives you an idea of how much balance was at stake. Like Edward III, especially trying to avoid the civil wars that he had witnessed during his late father's reign, and actually failing at the very end of his life, proving also that a timid monarchic policy was not really the best one. Edward I would be instead a warrior king himself, and would settle much of this matter himself by the sword, as we've seen also in the many videos we made on Edward I's Longshank. I'm very, very glad to have covered his reign, because it's one of the single most important in medieval Europe. Besides, consider that the 13th century, even in the so-called national monarchies like England and France that don't nominally have a universal role, actually that imperial grandeur, we've seen it also for Castile, is very pronounced, it's very strong, right? There are tendencies like this also for Sicily, for Hungary. There is probably an imperial undertone to all these powers. And there is no doubt that the Kingdom of England, regarding of its military failures at the beginning of the century, was a very robust, a very sound force, especially in this time in history. So episodes like the one of 1258 marked an early recognition of the commons' role in balancing power, as seen in the summoning of knights to the Model Parliament of 1295 under Edward I, which set a precedent for broader representation. We tend to forget the knights. Also, the Holy Roman Empire had an interesting history of that, especially not much because there was a greater commoners recognition in that regard, because these are still aristocrats, as not, but because it was very politically fragmented, and so those were the guys. And in fact, the same emperor would make leverage on trying to bargain some provincial power, especially after the collapse of the German national monarchy that had attempted, in fact, to survive during this era. We're exactly here in the age of the Interregnum, or slightly later, depending here, 58-95. You know that the English interfered. Richard of Cornwall, the same brother of Henry III. Again, all topics we will come to cover again in specific depth. You know, I have literally, I think, thousands of videos about medieval history specifically, so you can definitely search in my enormous playlists. During the 14th century, however, things changed a bit, because the influence of magnates over the kingdom grew significantly, especially after the mid-14th century crisis, as we explained in many cases. And this essentially started from the fact that the crisis, the big crack of Eurasian civilization and beyond, reduced, of course, public power, eroded such institutions, the privates obtained more power, the crown had probably less territorial control, and so we've seen this also in videos about the lordship of Ireland. Everything, the French became ever more autonomous, and especially entrenched in an ever more also local dimension, and it would take centuries before this impasse could simply be surpassed, and especially coming back to those same stretches of imperial power that these countries had enjoyed, especially during the 13th century, early 14th one. I will skip here especially how this happened, because especially the reign of Edward III is quite telling, as one of the most successful ones, but still basically ending in a pretty grim way at the same time, when in fact the crisis had fully kicked in. In any case, just to stick to England as an example, lords there exerted authority over the executive branch and closely oversaw the appointment of the king's ministers and councillors, leveraging their control over regional shires, judicial circuits, and private retinues to entrench their power. This may sound paradoxical if you think even how Edward III could prevail after having removed certain magnate control after his minority, and how heavy the legacy also of previous monarchs had been like this. We've seen how many factional issues occurred at court, etc. But there is no doubt that the monarchy felt choked by this, and it's not like you can see it even in France. Typically speaking, if you think about the clash between the Armagnac and Bourguignon, they were actually the same. In this case of England, the same Plantagenet branches, the same. In a way or another, different degree heirs to the throne that had the actual power to do so. First of all, because they were the more powerful magnates, right, in the kingdom, but in this sense also because they could succeed to one another on the throne, and they were felt also by the other estates as, you know, after all, they had something to do with that specific business. So it's not really, again, a classist revolution or anything of that kind. These are basically very close to the crown. They're actually members of the same royal family. This, however, doesn't mean that the public authority wasn't eroded by this. The magnates' dominance was reinforced by their vast land holdings that, as we explained, had even further entrenched during this period, and that generated wealth through rents, feudal dues, and so their strategic appointments, for example, of sheriffs and justices of the peace effectively blended local and royal authority. in their favor. Again, in England especially, this is very pronounced, right? There is a much more sort of provincial dimension of this. It's paradoxical to an extent because, after all, England did really revolve around London, and even in the contemporary districtuation of the UK, you know that basically there aren't sort of major provinces like in other countries, like you could say in Germany, in France. It still remained down to that sort of smaller county dimension. But in those places, that's a process paradoxically of actually the kingdom was more unitary than others, but still power was parceled in that smaller levels in the periphery, as things were settled, of course, in the main center. So it's very unique, right? England has such particular physiognomic characteristics. I made a video about the issues that Richard II had with the barons. He reigned between 1377 and 1399, and there were multiple crises during his reign. In any case, he had sought to strengthen royal power by cultivating a loyal court faction, promoting figures like Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole, and asserting prerogative rights through policies like the expansion of royal household expenditure, etc. So this actually was always the same mean. It's sort of strange how sometimes, at least in the popularized version of historiographical topics and this kind of historical figures in particular, like the king, was it bad? Was it he good? And what's your opinion? What's your say? It's not like judgment can swing between not just the guy was just bad or the guy was just good. Like, first of all, we're talking history, meaning that you have to filter. Either you are an expert on the actual sources to objectively assess, at least in a conventional way, whether like a certain political decision was a mistake or not, or you're basically just deciding to have a specific bias and sympathy for reasons that, however, may not be convincing. If you follow a principle of power, you can do better in that sense, because at the end of the day, it's not very important whether this guy was good or bad, like whatever you intend by that, but whether he was actually capable of ruling and doing so with effective results. But as you know, the same Richard faced, because of these attempts, to especially win for the crown a very specific set of boundaries within which the same monarchy could operate without the interference of these ever more toxic baronial figures. He faces temporal defeat in a baronial uprising that, however, was also backed by the commons. And this shows you, of course, that it was never like, again, just a simple dichotomy. People tend to reason like that because it's easier. But if you add just another estate to the equation, you understand how there could be swings even in this regard. This culminated, by the way, in the merciless Parliament of 1388, orchestrated by the Lords Appellant, including Thomas Woodstock and Henry Bolingbroke, which purged Richard's court through executions and exiles, accusing his advisors of treason. In 1383, the Parliament had already enacted stringent measures against the king's courtier, including the impeachment of Chancellor de la Pole, which eroded, of course, Richard's authority and foreshadowed his final deposition. These measures reflected broader tensions, of course, as Parliament increasingly demanded oversight of royal finances, particularly war taxation during the 100 Years' War. Right here, we are a bit in between, those phases of less activity compared to the major sort of the hottest phases of, in fact, this set of wars between 1337 and 1453. But as we explained also, in fact, in the videos about the 100 Years' War armies, the English one in particular, England was always here on the edge, right? Even a defeat in one of the greatest battles of the war that turned out, fortunately, in fact, for England to be clamorous victories, regardless of the end of the war itself, would have actually brought to further the structuring of the monarchy, not the entire collapse. But in fact, the same end of the war is a pretty good reminder of what went on with the Wars of the Roses, the decimation of the House of the Lords that paradoxically actually boosted monarchic power as far as lots of the competitors had been taken out in the process, but definitely not in a much stronger counter, especially because of all the consequences after the war and beyond. So this is an interesting perspective as well. Richard II's attempts to reassert control through a personal affinity and manipulation of legal process ultimately led to his abdication in 1399, following Bolingbroke's rebellion and the accusation of tyrannical governance. So it's always the same scenario. We also made a video about the French nobility revolts of the 15th century that had another outcome. Here you actively see in England, so the victorious England of the 100 Years' War, in these generations. Still, however, a monarchic power being checked, mostly due to, it's always mostly about that, the greatest expenses involved, that there are the military ones in the continent. It's not like, by the way, individual noblemen do not take chance on their own through their private assets to launch invasions, etc., but it's about how much they can actually control this a bit as a mob, as opposed to simply being subject or at least feeling greater pressure from a central government. With the rise of the Lancaster dynasty under Henry IV in 1399, intense rivalry between royal authority and the influence of magnates and parliament persisted. In fact, throughout much of the 15th century, as we were pointing out, exacerbated again by fiscal crisis, from ongoing wars, the economic strain of maintaining garrisons in France, which was becoming basically the most also effective way. We've seen it from the French side, and so there had to be a collimation there of symmetry regarding the expenses. And it's not like England had necessarily more resources than its opponents. Also because at this point, really, military expenses, we've seen it very well in the videos about the Bande d'Ordonnance, the spread of also like the Lancia Spezzate, these forces that are becoming properly permanent in the sense they receive half salary or full salary even in time of peace. So they're always there. These were companies like the ones that we illustrated also for the 100 Years' War, emerging from mostly like disbanded veterans at some point, were in part, by the way, in the same royal armies, often coming from the same subject lands, like the same nobility organized them as enterprises and so on, but becoming, let's say, a very important cost, right, for maintaining them in a strategically effective way across regions. And so it's something that could not simply be sustained by, for example, the individual noble as well. So when you look at actually the decline of English power during the 100 Years' War in the latter phase, and finally the English basically bailing out of the continent almost completely, the obvious there is that a weaker monarchy had prevented the nobility to have, in fact, a more unitary control on the same national strategic assets, and that classical principle of the art of war, of unity of command, here brought simply to a broader shortcoming. And even though the monarchy was still there, right, was still functional to a degree, like among also the fortunes of war, of course, to the gradual defeat, right? And this internal factionalism was immediately evident in the most concrete consequence of the defeat in the 100 Years' War, the aforementioned Wars of the Roses. Just think about, for example, maintaining certain troops just by ravaging somebody else's country. This was a great advantage for the English. Like, you send troops abroad, overseas, like just literally across the channel, because you can't simply loot and pillage there, and it's not your own kingdom, right? You can't, it's not that simple, right? Because you have local communities that have to sustain you. Think about Gascony at times, Normandy, etc. But again, such scattered approach cannot be really functional. That's also why the Wars of the Roses, in a general sense, happened. I made a couple of videos about the Wars of the Roses years ago. We have to come back on them. Mostly battles, but also tactics. And we have witnessed how this was basically a private showdown of the higher nobility of England. That, by the way, didn't even particularly damage the country from a material point of view, because there weren't such huge armies simply ravaging the countryside. It was just like these noblemen giving each other a date at a given place, because their specific objective was strictly dynastic and hereditary. Like if you killed that guy in front of you on foot, you could not escape. You would settle the matter once for all, because that branch of the family was out, and you could simply succeed in his stead, right? So this was very important. By the way, the Wars of the Roses dragged on for quite a long time, 1455, 1487. The Commons' growing assertiveness in this period is an interesting figure, seen in petitions for fiscal reform and the impeachment of figures like the same royal protege William de la Pole in 1450, underscored a shift towards parliamentary influence, though magnates retained significant control through their patronage networks and private armies. This happened because, as we explained, same political actions of the crown were not necessarily appreciated even by the Commons. William de la Pole was, by the way, decapitated on a boat. In a way, if the monarchy is troubled enough, and as we've seen in England, there isn't much of an independent third estate involved in properly the management of the kingdom, you would basically have, as also witnessed in the Wars of the Roses, the nobility having more autonomy, and mostly this third estaters also depending on their fortunes, mostly at the local level, being demanded less, as we've seen, because these private armies, yes, are costly, but they're not like the royal ones at a broader national scale. And that's exactly the way which like English power shrinks at the end of the Middle Ages to a degree that wouldn't in fact be recovered, for example, for a military point of view, until Cromwell, right? And so this really gives you, for example, here the pattern of what happens when a state is destructured, right, and tends to fail, and or at least to be remodeled on a sort of lower profile in terms of actual reach of power itself. Again, England's monarchy, as we know, survives at least up to the 17th century in a way that still has some pretty solid power as the pivot of the system, as a matter of fact. But the barons are always lurking in the shadows, and even more, as a matter of fact, coming out in the open for a fight. And that definitely is a civilizational burden along the way. Passing to other countries, the nobility's dominance was equally pronounced in other regions. As we were saying the other day, this is really typical of Central Europe, where, as you know, the local monarchies will actually fail at a certain point in their history. Poland being dismembered in the 18th century by other powers, Hungary being taken over, the same way between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. And much of the premises for that were institutionally founded in the later Middle Ages. Also in that case, in parallel to the crisis of the later Middle Ages. That reinforces very powerful oligarchs in countries where, in fact, the monarchy had never really been overwhelmingly functional in power concentration, and also nominally extending over wide territories that, in this sense, were also difficult to control. So because Central Europe was less populated, had less communications, had just less surplus, you understand how a crisis eventually weighs on that, even just from a physical principle, like things go more easily wrong, than right. So that between the 14th and the 15th centuries, the aristocracy in Poland and Hungary held overwhelming sway over the crown already. This pattern was mirrored also, as we'll see now better, also in Castile and the Scandinavian nations. I talked especially much about Castile in the last year or so, and we will be a bit more precise about what happened. About Scandinavia, we talk less, and actually I very much like later medieval Scandinavian history. I think it's very underrated, especially compared to the Viking era that this came to have properly like almost chronological scanning, at least in Anglo-Saxon historiography for the entire continent, even though like 2/3 of Europe had barely anything to do with the Vikings to begin with. In any case, in Poland, the nobility secured extensive privileges through the privilege of Košice in 1374. This was granted by Louis I of Anjou. The Angevins arrived to rule also in Poland to famously ensure noble support for his daughter's succession. This is what would actually bring to eventually like the Jagiellonians, right, to succeed, and eventually like the union between Poland and Lithuania, right. There were other choices, by the way, so things could notoriously go, especially in these countries where more or less it was the elite marrying a sort of long range to reinforce his own position as recognized by these other powers struggling, right? This is really typical. It was happening also in Germany, etc. It was mostly safeguarding this ultra-elite position, even in countries were fundamentally politically destructured, and in fact, basically shipwrecked towards this elective direction to at least reinforce the position of the monarchy. The Charter of the Privilege of Košice exempted nobles from most taxes, which also is not really how you want to go, because these guys are properly the ones that control the most in the country, right? In Central Europe, peasantry autonomy, especially in Slavic countries or in Hungary, is pretty feeble, right? It's not even like in Germany where there are at least some communes, there is some more thriving activity. Actually, Germans are imported in these countries to foster that properly by the monarchy, triggering also the oligarchs, this cahier de doléances, so to say, reinforcing that sort of national identity. Okay, we are Poles, we are Hungarians. Why does the king import Germans? Actually, these oligarchs were doing the same in their own lands, but of course, the kings, Germans, Jews, etc., were conferred with the ultimate public privilege that was obviously recognized by the same nobility, because it was convenient for them to be also reinforced, just like through these charters, by a higher institution like the monarchy. I mean, nobody at this point was really putting that power in question, like that institution into question. But this charter also guaranteed the nobility right to approve extraordinary levies, meaning that when the king required a specific levy, we're talking mostly for military purpose, again, lots of money, the oligarchs' assembly could refuse, right? They really needed to give their approval for that, otherwise it could not be levied, and secured, in fact, the nobiliar dominance over the Sejm, that is to say, Poland's parliamentary assembly, the Polish parliament, which curtailed royal authority under the early Jagiellonian dynasty. In fact, in many ways, importing a foreign dynasty, as you know, was a way to avert some further monarchic centralization, right? An ethnic and national king would have been stronger, right? And what happens in these Central European countries is mostly, as we've seen, the Angevins, the Jagiellonians, we'll see now the Luxembourgs, and so on. By the way, if you're interested in these topics, there is not just quite viewed medieval Central European history playlist, but of course, like a Polish, Hungarian, etc. playlist that are, quite also covering century by century, all these topics. In Hungary, magnates under Sigismund of Luxembourg, reigned 1387-1437, controlled vast estates and private armies, often acting as semi-independent regional powers. Hungary resembled more an empire than a kingdom proper. If you read the title of, say, the various possessions belonging to the King of Hungary, in parallel to that, like as territories, they're not even part of the crown, but associated with it. It's like a kilometric list. But in fact, the country did not really quite control this entire system directly, as just as most powers at the time, even more in this case, plus, again, all the sort of civilizational shortcomings deriving from certain unsettled business, especially with the oligarchs in Hungary, plus, the steps in between and something else, like the Hussites, for example, in the same period at the French. In any case, Sigismund, as you know, was a very powerful ruler, and he had quite a contrast with some of the most influential families in Hungary, like the Garai, the Italy, who dominated royal councils and military campaigns against the Ottomans, that, by the way, were yet another problem knocking at the door in the south as well. And so at that point, if anything, the pressure was put on those privates that had, yes, managed to emancipate themselves from direct royal control, but that now were in sort of great trouble. In Castilla, the most powerful of the Iberian monarchies, and a very feudal country that had, like in that typical Spanish way, sort of had difficulties to fully upgrade also towards a more centralized system compared to the English, the French. We've seen it also from a military point of view. The 100 Years' War, theater in Spain during the crisis of Castilian succession was a sort of a wake-up call for the local rulers, also for the establishment of a more effective uniformed military alongside the pattern again of these Western companies. Was really troubled, right? Was witnessing continuous social political crisis that arose essentially from the dominance of the grandes, so of these magnates, whose power derived from the encomiendas, so the land and labor grants, and mercedes, royal favors. So you understand how the feudal system was pretty similar across Europe. The Castilians had, again, a very sort of large estate, magnate-based system going on, which also made them more similar to, a French power comparatively. The Aragonese were sort of more confederal. They had a more of a maritime-based business, as you know, and were more fragmented. The Castilians had a more imperial and tendentially hegemonic role in the Iberian Peninsula. But everything was all sort of blended with these private interests and the difficulties of the crown. Naturally, all those private possessions enriched the nobility further through agricultural surplus and control over Castilian towns as well, and made a specific video explaining how, to make the long story short, towards the end of the Middle Ages, there was essentially a game of cooptation, like giving more privileges to this nobility, but still in exchange for the recognition of monarchic power in other fields, because fortunately for the Castilians, the system was going ahead, right? There were some more solid fundamentals than in other parts of Europe. By the mid-15th century, the upper nobility, possessing extensive landed estates and deeply involved in the wool trade through the Mesta, that controlled essentially the largest wool production in Europe, powerful organization of sheep herders established in 1273, wielded significant control over royal offices that were at least recognized as such. And so again, given the possibility of this nobility to be co-opted, although of course heavily interfering in the same system. The same was true for the municipal administrations and knights themselves. Castilla had interesting sort of military power coming from towns. We've seen it in the videos about its army organization. Knights, also the ones of the monastic military orders of the Reconquista, had always been an important element, especially in the south. The border was still the Moorish Emirate of Granada, and checking in part still the Maghrebine attempts to reinvade Spain, even this late in time, manipulated local governance through the patronage over these communities from top, again, of their private power, enormous private power, and through marriage alliances with the royal family and among one another, so essentially constantly reinforcing their own status and prestige. The Grande's economic dominance was bolstered by Castile's role as leading wool exporter to Flanders and Italy, that, as you know, were the most specialized textile working regions in Europe, generating wealth that, in fact, rivaled royal revenues as well. And again, it's very interesting that the Mesta stemmed from these private assets, because essentially this enormous wool production stemmed from the more frontier areas of the Reconquista, where stable settlements, more permanent agriculture had been impossible due to all those raids, not because the land would have not allowed it. And so basically, also when the Christians swarmed into Andalusia after 1212 Las Navas, rather than investing with more scientific means in a great projectural structured plan, it would have been really difficult to achieve in these times in the Middle Ages, even by the same crown. In fact, it didn't do this as well. They simply took control of what was locally available and fostered this further. This was the sheep herding. A confrontation with King Henry IV of Castile, we will see this, his reign was between 1454 and 1474, became almost unavoidable with this powerful nobility, as his legitimacy was challenged during the so-called Farce of Avila in 1465, where, almost ironically, nobles symbolically deposed the king in favor of his half-brother Alfonso, accusing Henry of weak governance and favoritism towards converso advisors. This is interesting because, of course, was an offense, right? He was accused of cowardice, not being a man, not being worthy, being the better one. As you understand here, these family connections within the royal family are always sort of double-edged. It was really typical, again, to witness the higher nobility sponsoring one element of the family was thought to succeed, also considering how easily people died before time, also not by simple natural causes at the time. The converses are also interesting because, as we were saying before, for the Germans and the Jews in Central Europe, in Spain you have, again, the Mudéjars that constitute a pretty wide minority, to say the least, especially in certain parts of the Iberian Peninsula. We're talking Muslims and Jews that are converted in this sense to Christianity, but becoming, say, under the edge of their redemptors, so to say, and maintaining often even certain cultural practices on their own, but being in theory outcast, at least compared to the establishment. They were more loyal because to especially the king, because without that central authority, without that protection, they would have been dead out there, or at least would have not had that much power, right? So you understand how similar dynamics represent themselves at the same time. That was also the practice of having, Moorish bodyguards at some point in history, or like from the Islamic side, Christian ones, etc. Now, with the support of his advisors, notably Juan Pacheco, Henry IV of Castile established a centralized and regional bureaucracy in the process, including the Consejo Real, to streamline governance, which was also much to the chagrin of the higher nobility, because it cost a lot, but times had, we're in the mid-15th century, state bureaucracy administration had necessarily gone ahead also in Spain. They didn't really have even just a broader, this is before, of course, the dynastic union of Castilian and Aragon. That was not a statile union, by the way, but there really weren't overall, other than the kings, like sort of regional assemblies, tribunals, etc. So we're talking a strong necessity, civilizationally speaking, which allowed, in fact, and this was always the same point as well, the establishment of a permanent army, also a pretty big one, because Castile was pretty big as a wall, right, as a kingdom, through the Santa Hermandad. We will see this specifically because it's a chapter aside, even, in fact, left out in that video about the Spanish and Portuguese army organization that I made, because it's really something very peculiar. Essentially, a militia that doubled as a police force to curb noble violence as well, right? Showing that those lesser estates of Castile were, however, not heavily subjected, especially like, I don't know, in Central Europe, for how disorderly that Iberian society, especially for how big, right, the possessions of the Crown of Castile were, there was enough, I don't know, for example, city power to curb, again, the nobility, to at least to make leverage from the monarchic and to force, to pressure the nobility. Henry IV also introduced protectionist policies to bolster the growing textile industry that evidently was intertwined with the nobiliary one, but around which the entire country's economy revolved. So even when, again, you have the very strong powers within the country, if the civil fundamentals, the statal fundamentals of the country are solid, they have been recognized, there isn't even that much of an interest, of a purpose to do things separately, right? And this, again, depends largely on what kind of pre-existent also culture exists for the foundation of that sense of statehood, right? In Spain, in the sense it was stronger than, I don't know, in certain parts of Central Europe. The monarchic power at this point was consolidating to the degree that Henry could include a ban among his provisions on exporting a portion of the annual wool output, which would, in the sense, stabilize domestic production and counter foreign competition from English and Flemish cloth markets. These reforms, however, provoked resistance from the nobility, who saw especially their economic privileges threatened fueling the Civil War 1474-1479, that, by the way, accompanied Isabella I's succession. It's an incredibly turbulent moment. Again, we outlined this as a positive, linear progress, but it was accompanied by an incredible degree of bloodshed and destruction, of instability, of unknown, right? You may want to appreciate this as a lesson, because we know eventually how things went, but if you look even at these various states, it is true, as we said, some fail, especially under the pressure of others, but as you understand, in the West, these states actually succeed. It's not like at some point in history they are destroyed. No, they only consolidate more. This is very specific of Western Europe. The unification of Denmark, Norway and Sweden formalized in 1397 at Kalmar under King Erik of Pomerania, as you know, was established with the approval of the nobles from all three kingdoms, who held greater power than their respective crowns, dictating fiscal and military policies through councils like the Danish Riksråd, the Norwegian Riksråd, and the Swedish Riksdag. The Kalmar Union, like the Kalmar Union, was orchestrated by Queen Margaret I as the expression of the Danish upper hand on the Union. All right, and I made some videos on the Scandinavian monarchies illustrating the very famous dynamics. Essentially, Denmark had managed especially to control Norway in, again, quite a what was typical at times in especially the history of the two countries, like having the same king for both at times. And in any case, Denmark, of course, was the strongest, the more powerful, and had also a capacity to hegemonize the Swedish political direction, so to say. And in fact, the Swedish were not just the most discontent of the Kalmar Union, but also the ones that would endly make it fail. However, it's a long history. Margaret I is also a very dramatic and beautiful character. We'll talk about her more in depth again in other medieval Scandinavian history videos. And the major deal of Denmark in this, as the most advanced, or also the longest sighted of these powers, was to consolidate, especially Scandinavian power, especially against the Hanseatic League that influenced these same countries, and in order to secure Baltic trade routes. Right, there was mostly an interest to be at war with the Hanseatic League, that, as you know, was essentially a formidable cluster of even fairly small towns, right? But that altogether provided with not just sort of the most florid market in the north and in the Baltic seas, but in fact with a significant naval power that was used essentially to blackmail the Scandinavian kingdoms, at some point coming to ravage their portual facilities, and creating havoc, and also supporting at some point like proper coup. There had been, especially in the 14th century, even a German takeover from Holstein in terms of like German companies spreading out in Europe and seizing control of the fact of the kingdom of Denmark. Naturally, Scandinavian monarchies were fairly weak right until the end of the Middle Ages. In fact, one of the reasons why the Hanseatic League had that great success without being any sort of like unified state, like could be, I don't know, other maritime powers like Venice, for example, Genoa, in the Mediterranean, with which they were also in strong contact, by the way, commercially wise, was exactly a bit like the fragmentation of the German monarchy, to say the least. The weakness, in fact, of the Scandinavian kingdoms. And so this sort of fractal area in between that could allow, especially for some important degree of autonomization, but definitely not allowing for some broader statual development. Besides, the same Hanseatic cities were often in competition with one another. They were still nominally in their own sectors of the German hinterland under the relative prince that ruled there. So I made a video about the Hanseatic League. It's extremely interesting. I also made a video about their government. You can find in the same medieval government playlist. The main deal was preventing essentially the Swedish market, especially of iron that was dug in there, to be open to the Hanseatics, because that also fueled further military capacities from that side. This would bring to we'll see it now, to Swedish rebellions. So you understand that there were estates in these countries that, regardless of the geographical proximity, also the fair, in fact, overall Norse cultural kinship, were quite difficult to simply centralize, because the surplus was quite scarce. Also, the same local autonomies had never reached very strong levels of institutional development. Basically, the Scandinavian communes are clusters of villages that were to obtain these charters to bully one another into some sort of mob kind of subjection. And indeed, the Kalmar Union masked an effort by the Danish nobility to dominate the other nations as well, leveraging their control over lucrative herring fisheries and tolls at Öresund. Danish magnates such as the Thott and Guildenstern families used their wealth and castles to exert influence, often sidelining Norwegian and Swedish interests, even though the former were mostly subordinated to the Danish ones. However, the Kalmar Union soon collapsed due to rebellions by Norwegian, especially Swedish nobles, with the latter forced to share authority with Stockholm's merchants and owners of silver and copper mines, as well, whose wealth from the Falun copper mines, in particular, a cornerstone of Sweden's economy, especially by the 30s of the 15th century, fueled economic autonomy in loco, right? So allowing these local communities to interfere with the broader Danish hegemonic project. Famously enough, the Engelbrekt rebellion, 1434-1436, led by, in fact, Engelbrekt and Engelbrektsson, a mine-owing noble, united Swedish nobles and burghers as well. There were lots of peasants, by the way, as well, against Danish overreach, highlighting tensions between centralized ambitions and regional autonomy. Most of the clash would not even occur in the hinterland, because we would even venture for war into the Swedish sort of humid and forested territory. But that's where, again, those mining resources came from. Most of the struggle would follow, in fact, the path of the Seine towards the coastlands. It was sufficient, essentially, to control in that case, the Swedish coastline and the major markets, particularly Stockholm, to basically block the exports towards the Hanseatic cities that, however, had their own naval power, and given the overall political fragmentation and fluidity of the picture, as you understand, would find a way through. There were ferocious fightings, some of the most radically violent chapters in late medieval warfare in the north, so much so that the Kalmar Union faltered at different points. Telling truth lasted long enough, right, until the early 16th century. However, there were moments in which things seemed lost. Again, being some of these rulers was a nightmarish experience, but hell, what kind of experience? The rebellion's success in deposing Erik temporarily fractured you were talking Erik of Pomerania, that had in the meanwhile succeeded, basically. But it would be useful to make greater references to this all, especially his background. I never made a video about Pomerania specifically, but it's a very important state, especially at this point. And they were mingling, essentially. These were Germans that in many ways represented also some kind of nobiliary power that was in part exploiting the same Hanseatic one, in part keeping it in check, depending on where they had to rule themselves. Because one thing was, sabotaging the Scandinavian kingdoms. Then when you managed to succeed to the throne of one, you really tended to follow the same policy we wanted to hegemonize one in some way, depending on how the countries were aligned in the moment. So what happened is that this ruler was overthrown, and Sweden elected independent regents like Karl Knutsson, though Danish influence did persist until the Union's final dissolution in 1523. I really want to make other videos about the Kalmar Union, because it's one of the single most important topics in Scandinavian history, and just very interesting to browse. An important reference to France is necessary as well. We talked, as we were just saying, about the 15th century French revolts in a recent video. But it's important to look at the 14th century as well, because quite interesting things were going on even there with the commons. In fact, during the mid-14th century, we're talking the most difficult times, the Black Death, the Bac of Poitiers, the capture of King John II, the Jacquerie, that is this massive peasant revolt that followed to basically the failure of the monarchy, etc., witnessed the État Général in Paris, the General Estates, in the capital, aiming to secure effective control of the monarchy. In this case, the primary force driving the rebellion was the nobility, who sought to limit royal taxation and assert influence over military strategy. As you know, the Capetians were a pretty close-knit lineage. They controlled basically all the strings of France, but this situation was much more nuanced by the fact that the same Paris was, as you know, the largest city in Europe, together with Milan. We don't know exactly which one was the largest, and especially was the capital of the largest and most powerful country as a whole, right? And going under this dramatic crisis, saw the opportunity, witnessed at least the opportunity from the side of the third estate, of the merchants, to mount wars here, especially hoping for some kind of collapse of public authority that could leave Paris sort of free to trade without too many constraints and no taxes, basically, from the king. The Estates General of 1355-1358 were probably in the eye of the storm during the war that would bring to Poitiers, demanded reforms, including oversight of royal finances and the right to approve war subsidies, reflecting noble frustration with mismanagement and English territorial gains. As always, this was some sort of an excuse, also of some further self-sabotage. At least there was some kind of metus hostilis that brought French forces together and said, what the hell do we do? Consider that the king was in exile, was in prison, actually, in London. The country had to gather properly the astronomic cipher that occurred for the ransom. And this situation was, however, exploited by those who took the reins of the kingdom to, in fact, to put their hands also on what up to that point had been sort of the crowns. At the same time, the third estate in Paris was not happy with the same nobiliar control of the situation. In fact, as you've seen, they wanted to properly get rid of anything at the top. This was actually pretty interesting prefiguration of, you can argue, almost a bourgeois revolution. And considering the French history in general, and how many of the later, in fact, revolutions would look at the Fronde, etc., or during the wars of confessional, the French wars of religion, aside from obviously like the most, the storming of the Bastille and so on, started from that center. And you have the third estate, we don't like, not even the nobility here, we don't even want them, even when the king is knocked out. This tells you also how powerful, especially the marchands de l'eau, the merchants of the Seine, really were at this point. I made a video about medieval Paris. We partially tackled this topic. And you have, in fact, the famous Etienne Marcel, the provost of Paris's merchant community, that in 1358, during the Jacquerie, and as a part of the same, basically, mobilized urban and peasant discontent against noble exactions and war devastation. Robert Lecoq, Bishop of Laon, who came from a family of legal scholars and had practiced law prior to his episcopal consecration in 1351, was also attacked during this uprising. Lecoq's expertise in Roman law informed his advocacy for conciliar governance aligning with noble interests to curb royal absolutism while promoting legal reforms, but also trying to tame the Jacquerie that, of course, was threatening the same nobility. It was an incredibly angry third and fourth estate uprising mixed, depending on, like the third estate, like the fourth, but could easily mobilize it. And especially getting some of its power through the obvious centrality of Paris, also in the market sort of agricultural, let's say, production dependency from the main center. The Jacquerie and Marcel's alliance with Charles of Navarre, it's a very interesting figure we will see at some point. A noble essentially with royal ambitions. We partially talked about him in a video about the Duchy of Burgundy, because at this time basically the Burgundian faction takes a pretty erratic direction compared to the monarchy, and at that point Charles of Navarre was trying through incredibly shrewd means and marriage policies and more, and war, as a matter of fact, because he ruled in Navarre, right? We have to cover that region's history because it's very interesting. It was a Frenchman, in part of the higher nobility of France, tried in fact to inherit a great deal of what would have actually ended in the hands of the Burgundians, especially in the northeast of Paris. So you have this very weird situation where Charles is fairly distant to become properly a king in the moment. At least he could have gained an enormous level of power, maybe tried, of course, to rule from Paris. But he was better than the other nobles from a Parisian perspective that, as we've seen, didn't properly want nor a king nor an establishment to rule on the city. Plus, there is the peasant rebellion because the English are swarming across the French countryside with their devastating chevauchée. And so the world seems really, it has literally gone upside down. And there is really an attack that is really very strong, also ideologically speaking, to the entire point, basically, of the traditional world order. Just in the aftermath of the Black Death, of all the shock that had derived from that at so many different levels, moral, political, social, economical, plus military one, because Poitiers had witnessed, we made a video about the Battle of Poitiers. We've seen how big the French army was, how costly, right, aside from the defeat. But just on top of that, right, it's not like they had sent a small army, had been defeated. Well, okay, no, they lost the king, yes, but also some of the most, properly the most important noblemen of France as a symbol of the legitimacy of their own rule, of their own establishment. Right, and Jacques was really scary. It was the largest uprising in late medieval history, and one, in fact, that would not be matched until the German Peasants' Revolt. Before, in fact, the French Revolution. Once again, I made a video about the German Peasants' Revolt, also in the video we made the day before yesterday. We talked about the 1514 Poor Conrad Revolt in Württemberg, just 10 years before that incident, that was connected with that, as we've seen at the Treaty of Tübingen, with the emanation of that charter that regulated the power of the Duke of Württemberg, that had also in that case sort of basically failed at war and with requiring enormous exaction. So you realize actually how important, civilizationally speaking, this the eternal aspect of, let's say, the funding power, right, for war and for, in fact, interests that are incredibly high, really engulfs civilizations. And not in the sense that those who pay for war actually fail. Of course, if you fail, militarily speaking, that happens, but you can't know it until you fight, and you must fight, because otherwise you have lost to begin with. So also what happens in the world nowadays, I think and especially from a Western perspective, we're actually in one of the easiest positions ever, right? It's not a moment of critical rapture, whatever. Actually, it's just laziness, pure laziness, and we waste an incredible amount of money for nothing. Like, we could have easily devolved so much just for higher military spending by rationalizing many other aspects. But people are unreasonable, and we live in a fallen world to begin with. And everybody pays that. If anything, history teaches you that there isn't the randomly lucky way out of this. When there are these massive systemic problems, either you fix them, you tackle them, and maybe even fail, maybe in the attempt, but if you don't try, it's over anyway, and it's going to go very badly anyway. So it's just pretty dumb not to support the system. And it's not like these political military failures aren't important either, because they contain part of that moral legitimacy, as we see here. But obviously, especially today, there's not even that really yet, fortunately. But you have to stay sharp and prepared, and spending in that. They're investing mostly, it sounds better, and it's more appropriate in that direction. By the way, in fact, there are some strange dynamics as well. It's the Saint Charles of Navarre that brutally represses the Jacquerie. Right, Charles of Navarre realizes that in order to gain the support of the rest of the French nobility, he has also to intervene with the forces that he has at his disposal to exterminate, if anything, the peasants, and letting Etienne Marcel will also be massacred for that matter. But again, the Jacquerie is a very complex topic. We'll surely make many videos based entirely on the dynamics. It was that messed up. And it tells you how, by the way, in France, of course, the aristocratic rule was not really an option, all right? So this is really relevant. The nobility's control over regional estates and private armies, particularly in provinces like Normandy and Brittany, ensured their centrality in French politics because they maintained some provincial control that was critical enough, mass-wise, to poke against like a French monarchy that was losing its own balance, right? And this was even, for example, under the reign of Charles V, reigning between 1364 to 1380, that brought, in fact, the sovereign to reassert authority through fiscal reforms and professionalized armies. In fact, we talked a lot about the latter. Again, how do you fix the system? Do you stop paying? No, you actually pay even more, because without a professional, functional force, a fit military, you can't solve this problem. And that's where, at least conventionally, we say that the first nucleus, at least, of a permanent army was established in medieval Europe, even though this was already going on. Philip the Cominic, we saw it many times, indicates that for example, like literally the Italian states at this point having even more troops at a point, is saying King of France, regularly under their service. But again, the notion of the permanency is mostly like an historiographical issue. The same France actually had something like that before. When we look at the virtual expendability and availability of certain troops, right? The fact that they started remaining permanent didn't really change. Like regarding the professionalism of the same, these were troops that either in public or private service were active anyway. We've seen it well in the video about the free companies. So as you understand, history is beautiful because you can always make the case that it is never separated like from the history of all the various protagonists, right? There isn't a country here that does not resent what is happening in other places. There is no doubt that all these dynamics reflect some important shortcomings of the systems. For the monarchies, they're easier to look at because, let's say, especially these were the bigger countries. We've seen it regardless of, the divides, but we've seen England, France, Castile, Poland, Hungary, right? So with the Kalmar Union, it's mostly this cluster of Scandinavian realms and sort of, again, a dynastic union. There aren't many other models around, and we've seen also, for example, in the case of the Italian communes, how certain systems go up, taking over the other communes, while others, in fact, fail, taken over by them. There are upheavals, revolts. We've seen also the destructuring of the Flemish communes. There were also actually less statile entities than these, basically just above the Hanseatic towns by scale. And again, the comparative lens is really necessary, because without that, like, what are we even talking about, right? I know that some people presume that there's just the story of their own country and the others do not exist, but you cannot understand European history if you don't understand this whole package of information and what was happening in all the other countries. Also because how can you give value to your country if you don't know what other countries were doing, really? It's really silly. And it means actually that you don't know anything about your own country. Let's be honest about that. So we're getting there. I have this very weird dynamic right now that last week I made those bangers that still get me views. because again, there were easier things to click on, and now the views are going down once again. Apparently YouTube is not showing my own videos in your own homepage as before, because I make the same exact videos, even better ones, and I got so very high views in prior months. I don't know what's going on. I don't know whether it's more AI made videos that pollute the entire mechanism. I don't know if people are starting to go on vacations or stuff like that, but it's important to keep up with this with the views, because if you don't at least keep this at the same level, it's gonna go down. It's going to be a spiral, and so ever less people are going to watch it, you included. So there is this weird thing that on YouTube, algorithm-wise, that even better content is not going to be promoted regardless of, in fact, the same quality, because somebody else decides this. This is really messed up, and frankly, I think it's outrageous for the general mechanism. I mean, if you really care about this content, you should prop it up, right? It's not served to you on the basis of YouTube's discretion. Like, if you really are interested in anything I say, if you really understand what kind of work I'm doing, and you understand its quality, that of course is easily, in the sense that it's really easy to choose so as well, is easily as vastly superior to most YouTube history channels. Like, the question is, keep sustaining the channel, right? Share this. Also, on other, don't be afraid to not to spam. Of course, like, spamming is not good, but say if you talk on, for example, other channels, ones that are getting views in the moment, like, look, Schwerpunkt made a video that is very similar about this, why don't you check that out, stuff like that. You're going to make a huge difference, because this is literally, again, content that I see from the stats. People watch when they're exposed to. But if YouTube, for some reason, I don't know what changed in the last month or so, it decides that it's not going to show this in your homepage as well. It's I don't know whether it's over, because ups and downs on YouTube are kind of normal, but this trend kind of never happened before, and it's sort of disturbing when I make the dump video that suddenly gets everybody's attention. It's not the algorithm. It always starts from you, right? It's not like YouTube knows in advance what my 2 hours long video is about, right? It's all about you. So let's be honest about this. I at least am static. I'm doing always the same thing, and again, with all its limits. But if something changes at this point, it's not, in the sense, on me. It's something else. And again, I should cope with that in effective ways. But at the same time, there is the easy way to do things, and this is basically the sharing, right? Also, because honestly, like, I don't know if you know, but do you realize that this stuff is what I say at university? Like, people pay pretty high fees to get this kind of content. I'm giving it to you just like for the cost of skipping some ad in between that YouTube enforce on it anyway, so that I monetize myself just to at least get the benefit of it. It's really nonsensical to waste the stuff, right? It's like you see a beautiful book on the street and you pass by because you don't need to say, I don't know what's written in it, or I may like it, but I don't know, I don't want to kneel. It's a sort of to pick it up. Like, it's pretty nonsensical at all level, and I don't know, honestly, how to to picture this better. And again, it's all very complicated, but again, views must go up. If you don't make them, you make them go up. It's going to be a great damage for everybody involved, and you're not going to benefit from it either. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.